Okay.
Good evening and welcome to Pony Club Victoria webinar series. We have tonight Jacqui Panozzo, who's going to do a webinar on parasite management in horses. So Jacqui was a riding member for 10 years at Durham Pony Club, which is in the West Gippsland zone. She now runs her own company called WormCheck, and I'm sure she will tell us all about that. And WormCheck basically offers horse and livestock owners fecal egg counts to assist with their parasite management needs. I was sort of thinking Jacqui is a great example of the Pony Club motto, a life with horses starts here. So when you embark on your horse journey, you're never really sure where you'll end up, and Jacqui's found something very interesting to do with her horse adventures. So welcome, Jacqui, and thank you for tonight, and I'll let you take over.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kathleen, for the intro and for inviting me to come on and give this webinar for you all. So today we're going to talk about worms and, more importantly, the more modern approach to how we manage them in our horses. So I thought we'd just start off a little bit about me. So because I'm going to be talking to you for 45 minutes or so, just so you can know my background and sort of how I ended up where I've ended up doing horses and worms. So as Kathleen said, I have been a pony club. I think it's turned out to be 12 years. I can't remember when I joined, but I was with Durham Pony Club, which is in West Gippsland, and through Pony Club, you know, you get that love for horses, and that for me turned into horse breeding. So I actually breed Connemara ponies, and I've got a very small stud, like 3 mares, but you can find that on Facebook if you want to look up some lovely Connemara ponies as well. So that's me and my horses, but I didn't actually study horse parasites. I did a PhD from 2015 to 2018 with Fed Uni out at the Gippsland campus. And I never entered into that thinking of doing horse parasites. It was actually a project looking at how to diagnose Strongyles, which is a type of worm. I'm going to talk a lot about Strongyles too, because that's the worm I know the most about, and they're actually the most problem in horses. But Strongyles are present in, it's a very big family of worm, and they're present in any sort of grazing animal. So my PhD was looking at what Strongyles wild deer have. It was a biosecurity project. So do wild deer carry the same worms as cows and sheep, etc.? But what it turned into was a project on looking at new ways of diagnosing parasites. So there's pretty much only one way to diagnose parasites, and that is a fecal egg count. So I've learned an awful lot about fecal egg counts and what's good about them and what's bad about them, but that isn't what tonight is going to be about. But I also did work on molecular diagnosis, which I'm hoping in the future, who knows, in 5 years' time, I might be able to give you a talk about new molecular diagnostic methods for parasitology. Well, that's at least where I'm hoping. So then when I finished my PhD, I didn't want to keep working in deer because I don't care about deer. I care about horses. So I took what I learnt about parasites and diagnosing parasites, and I moved that into offering a service for horse owners and livestock owners. So I've set up a little small business. I run it mostly through Facebook. It's called WormCheck. Here's my Facebook page if you want to go and follow that. I do try and post informational posts on that for you all. And so I do fecal egg counts. Here's me in my home lab at the back of mum and dad's shed with my microscope, because that's about all you really need to do an egg count is a microscope and the skill of how to do it, of course. And I also give demos to horse groups or livestock owner groups about, I'll come out with my microscope and we can all do egg counts together. And you might not be able to see it, but there's me with my laptop and my microscope, and I was showing some students some worm eggs that they got out of their horse's poo. Unfortunately, WormCheck doesn't pay the bills for me at the moment. It might one day, but until it does, I'm also employed as a lecturer back at Fed Uni. I joke that Fed Uni can't get rid of me because I did my undergrad there and my postgrad there, and now I'm working there as well. And I teach biology, biotechnologies, and animal health to undergrad students. So this evening, I'm going to talk to you about a few things. I've got them listed here so you can sort of see where we're going to go with this. But we're going to talk about what worms are important. I'm not going to really talk so much about what diseases they cause because that's sort of a different topic to what we really want to get into tonight, which is the management. And to understand the management, first we have to understand their life cycles, understand Faecal egg counts and parasite egg shedding. And then quickly run over other types of parasites that aren't as common or as important. And then hopefully be able to put them all together into a big yearly overall management guideline. So you can see how all of these Faecal egg counts and life cycles can be all put together into one way of managing them across the year. And I've just got a note here as well. I'm going to, when I talk about worms, I'll be using like species names or the scientific names. If you were to ask me a question about a horseworm and say, oh, my horse has got bloodworm, what should I do? I would actually look at you and say, I've got no idea what worm you're talking about. Because the common names, they're not set, and lots of people have got different names that describe the same worm. I saw someone somewhere they did write bloodworm somewhere, and I was having a discussion with a friend about it, and I said, I don't even know what worm they're talking about. Are they talking about large bowel worms, which are sometimes called bloodworms? Are they talking about small Strongyles, which are sometimes called bloodworms? So I'm going to be talking about them based on their species names, and that's actually, their species names is actually how they're listed. So I've got a wormer box here. That's how they're listed on the wormer box as well, in like a little tiny writing that I'll show you on another slide. And there's two sort of little concepts that I just want to talk about before we actually get into everything. The first is that worms aren't actually bad. This has happened just last century, in the 20th century, when humans developed all of these wonderful drugs. We sort of got this phobia of germs, and it's still around now, you know, put laundry sanitizer in your washing machine to kill all of the bugs. Well, bugs and germs and worms, if you go up the size scale of pathogens from bacteria up to worms, they're not evil. They aren't really there to kill you. It isn't in a worm's interest to kill a horse. If a worm kills a horse, it kills its host, and so therefore it doesn't survive either. So adult horses, and I say this is different in young horses that don't have proper immune systems, but an adult horse that's got a low to moderate, just a normal level worm burden, is normally completely healthy. And they happily live. They've got a balance happening between the worms that live in their intestines and their immune system. It's this happy balance where the worms are happy, the horses are happy, everyone's happy, and they all live usually in complete, you know, you wouldn't notice that they had an infection. And when we worm a horse, what we actually do is we upset that balance that they have between their immune system and their normal gut fauna, so the worms that naturally live there. So worming is important, and it does have its uses. Like if your horse is sick and you will need to worm it. But often that, 4 to 8 times a year worming might cause more trouble to the horse than if you only worm them once a year, because you're continually upsetting that balance. So that's just something quick. That's just something to keep in mind when I talk about egg counts later on, and I say your horse has worms, but don't worm it. And then, so worms aren't bad, but drug resistance definitely and certainly is. We've all heard about, I'm pretty sure we've all heard about like antibiotic resistance and the rise of superbugs. That happens in any sort of disease-causing agent. So worms can get drug resistance, where your horse will have worms, but you cannot remove those worms anymore because the worms are resistant to all of the drugs. And drug resistance occurs when you have overuse or incorrect use of those wormers. And when you have drug resistance, you can't actually fix it anymore. There's nothing you can do unless you wait for a new drug to be developed. And drugs are very difficult to develop. It takes forever to get new drugs developed. So rather than relying on drugs, you're better, overusing them and just hoping that a new one appears, you're better off to use them less and save them for when you actually do need them. So today's seminar is going to be hopefully showing you how we can get rid of that old worm every 6 to 8 weeks mindset, because that mindset is unsustainable. So this here is a picture that I got off the back of a wormer, and it lists all of the worms that wormer drug is effective against. And and you can see there's so many species here, and you're like, how do I need to know about all of these? There's so many here. I can't, this is overwhelming. Well, I'm going to help you out here a bit, because you don't need to worry really about any of them much. So we can say, go away, all of these. My crosses aren't working very well tonight. And what I want you to worry about is I just want you to worry about these ones. Small Strongyles. They're the ones that are the most common, and they're the ones that you should always base your parasite control plan around. So all of the other ones, they will all fit in with your other plan, so you don't need to worry about them. You don't need to see them and think, how do I control all of these? There's so many. How do I make sure what I'm doing is right? If you can set up a system that will control small Strongyles, it will usually control all of the other ones with it. So small Strongyles, they're also sometimes called cyathostomes, and 90 to 100% of all horse parasite infections are small Strongyles. When I do egg counts, I very rarely see anything else. And so because they're the most common, they are the ones that you need to base your management around. And if you have your management plan that controls them, all other types of parasites should fit nicely into that small Strongyles control plan. So the other parasites, you can just take away all of the words they had on the back of the box, and you can just group them as bots, tapeworms, pinworms, ascarids, and then there's the neck threadworms, they cause summer sores on the skin, but they're mostly common in the tropics and the subtropics. But all of these, so bots are probably the next most common after small Strongyles, and then maybe your tapeworms, and we're going to talk about these later on. But they'll all fit in, as I've said, with your small Strongyles management plan. You might have noticed that before small Strongyles, there was also large Strongyles. Now, large Strongyles are very rare because we've pretty much wiped them out with the use of modern worming drugs. they're making a comeback in Europe, but they haven't made a comeback here in Australia yet. And the small Strongyles are far more common. So they're the ones, once again, just pushing home the message that they're the ones that are the most common. You'll notice that there's a lot of species there listed of small Strongyles. Well, there is a lot. There's like over 40 species of them, but they all act very similarly. So they can all be treated and controlled the same way. They all have the same life cycle. They all generally cause the same sort of disease, and they're all susceptible to the same wormers. So you can class all of these many species of small Strongyles as simply just that, small Strongyles. So because they're the most common, I'm going to talk about them for the rest of this talk pretty much until the very end when I'll mention some of the others. I'm not going to go into much detail on the symptoms of what small Strongyles cause, and because all of these symptoms are quite general. Lots of things can cause colic, lots of things can cause weight loss, poor condition and diarrhea. So that's where fecal egg counts come in as a handy tool. But also because we're talking about management, not so much about the pathology of the actual worm. So here's the life cycle. As far as parasites go, small Strongyles have quite nice, simple life cycles. The adult worms will live in the horse's intestine. The adult worms will sit there happily away. Sometimes they suck blood, sometimes they don't. And they'll lay eggs. The eggs are passed out in the manure. And then on the grass, those eggs will hatch and develop into larvae. And then the livestock will ingest the larvae that then mature back into adult worms. So it's just this nice, simple life cycle. There's only one host. As far as parasites go, it's very simple. So, and it should be noted here as well that this can all happen in as little as 6 weeks. So this is why they used to tell you, worm your horse every 6 weeks, because to control a worm, you would need to break its life cycle. So if a life cycle is 6 weeks long, you would need to worm once every 6 weeks to break that life cycle down. So that's where that old 6 weeks came from. And then it's also because it is 6 weeks that small Strongyles are the most common, because that cycle can go so quickly, so reinfection can happen a lot quicker. Unlike, say, pinworms, which have a life cycle of, I think, about 5 to 6 months. So reinfection of pinworms happens a lot slower than reinfection with Strongyles. So if you want to see what they look like at each stage, here's an egg. Aren't they lovely? I think Strongyles eggs are beautiful. Maybe it's because I've spent far too long looking down a microscope hoping to see them. And then they hatch into these larvae here. So that's your larvae, and that's what they look like on the pasture. They live as these little very tough larvae that can survive on pasture. And then these here are the adult worms that have come out in the manure following a worming. So they're quite small, maybe anywhere between 5 and 10 millimeters in length, the adult Strongyles. Some of them are white and some of them are red, the adults. So that's one variation between species. But generally, they're the 3 stages of their life cycle. So the great thing about parasites is because they do lay eggs, you can look for those eggs to see if a horse is infected. So you take the manure and you look for how many eggs are in that manure sample. So a fecal egg count, FEC, will quantitate the number of parasite eggs. Sometimes you can also ID what the parasite is exactly based on the shape of an egg. For example, Strongyles, so there's 40 odd species of horse small Strongyles, but then there's probably hundreds and hundreds of Strongyles species across ruminants and horses, but all of their eggs look the same. but you can still look at it just here, like this one here, and say that is a classic Strongyles egg. So you would see that under the microscope, and then you would count them, and you get this value called EPG, which is the number of worm eggs. Oops, that wasn't meant to be there. That one. EPG, number of worm eggs per gram of manure. And then you use that EPG value to decide if a horse needs to be wormed or not. So a horse with a high EPG level would need to be wormed over a horse that's got a low EPG level, where you would say that egg count is low, horse doesn't need to be wormed at this point in time. So as I've said, I get ahead of myself. Usually you can only identify eggs to a group level. So you can identify them as, oh, that's a Strongyles, oh, that's a tapeworm. What else is there that you could see? Like that's a whipworm. You don't have whipworms in horses though, so I didn't want to go too far into that. But usually I will only look, when I do an egg count, if I see a Strongyles egg, I leave it as just that basic, that is a Strongyles. I had a person come up to me once at a conference, and I'd said in my poster, you know, I only ID'd at Strongyles level, and he said to me, oh, well, I can identify them down to species level, and I wanted to be like, yep, sure you can, buddy. But microscopy is very subjective and varied, so that's why you will get if you ever get a fecal egg count done, it'll just simply say you've got Strongyles eggs. Once you've had a fecal egg count done on a horse, it can be classified as a level of egg shedder, depending on the number of eggs that are in the manure. So if a horse's egg count is between 0 and 200, they're considered a low egg shedder. Between 200 and 500, they're considered a moderate shedder. And above 500, they're considered a high shedder. Now, there's this phenomenon called overdispersion or parasite aggregation, where it's been found that with any sort of, this happens with parasites in grazing animals, so not just horses, but you will have 20% of the horses in a herd will shed 80% of the eggs. So I'm just going to put some other pictures up. There we go. So this might be your herd here. And I should just note here as well, sorry, that these two, moderate and high shedders, are normally ones that need to be wormed. So this might be your horse herd. The red horse is a high egg shedder. So it sheds lots and lots of eggs onto the pasture that develop into infective larvae. The yellow horse is a moderate egg shedder, and then the green ones are low egg shedders. So it's just this pattern that we see in animals. So you might get all of your horses egg counted, and you might have one that's sitting at 1,000 eggs per gram, and then the other two horses might be sitting at 50. And some people find this really amazing. They're like, how does this happen? Why is it like this? I treat them all exactly the same. They all live in the same paddock. They all eat the same food. This is just something that just happens with any sort of pathogen or parasite in animals. So when we later on talk about what horses to worm, just keep in mind this egg shedding and the fact that usually within a herd, one horse will shed lots and lots and lots of eggs, and the others might not shed any at all. And just a point here, people also panic when they see that their horse is a high egg shedder. Something really annoying, I find it a bit annoying about horses, is that EPG levels do not always correlate to the number of worms that a horse has. So a horse could have a really high, or what's considered a really high egg count, so it might have an egg count of 2,000, but it can still be perfectly healthy. And that's just how the immune system interacts with the that horse's worm burden, because every horse is an individual and its response to a worm infection is unique to every horse. So once a horse has, the eggs have come out in the manure, they're going to hatch on the pasture. Now, there's a point here that I want to make that people might not realize, but at any point within your worm population, remember your worms live in the horse, they live as eggs in the manure, and they live as infective larvae on the grass. At any point, 90% of the worm population are actually larvae on your pasture. So when you worm your horse, you're actually only killing off 10% of the worm population on your farm, because you need to remember that the worms are in the horse, but they're also free living on the grass as well. And larvae are very, very, very tough, and they will survive from anywhere from 6 to 8 months on grass. If there's water, a bit of moisture, they'll survive for that long. Here in Australia, people will say, oh, what about over winter? Does it get cold enough for them? No. You would need a European or like a Northern American type winter to kill off larvae on the grass, where it gets below zero for an extended period of time. And then, so in Australia, the only time larvae would die is actually in summer, when it gets really hot and the larvae dry out because there's no water around for them. And then in warm, wet weather, eggs can hatch. They can go from being eggs in the manure to being ready to reinfect your horse in as little as 4 days. So control of your pasture is very important. We're going to talk about that as well. Once horses will graze, ingest the larvae off the pasture, and those larvae, I made a typo there, I was meant to say larvae will slowly develop into adult worms. Now, the adult worms don't actually cause much disease. They happily sit there within the horse. They're in that balance. But it's the larval worms that cause the majority of illnesses. So poor conditions, colics, that sort of sudden weight loss. That's usually linked to mass reinfection with larvae. And this is usually why people will have a colic event happen after they've wormed. It's got nothing to do with the wormer. What it's got to do with is the fact that horses have been wormed, the adult worms have been removed, and you create this void within the horse that is filled by this mass reinfection of larvae, which will lead to poor health. So now we're getting into the management part. So there's 2 ways to manage parasites. There's paddock or pasture management, and then there's fecal egg counts and worming. Which one do you think is more important? It's actually that paddock and pasture management, because with any disease, it's always better to prevent or limit infection than it is to treat the infection. And remember, 90% of the worms live on the pasture. So if you can reduce that 90%, then that's a big impact on the ability for a horse to be reinfected. So if you can control the larval populations on your pasture, then you can reduce infection rates. Because remember, worms are not bad, and we don't want to go into worm management anymore with this mindset that we need to eliminate them entirely. Instead, we now focus our control of parasites on lowering pasture contamination. So rather than controlling the number of worms within a horse by treating them to remove them all, what we need to do now is reduce the number of worms that are on the pasture to start with. Here are the 3 best ways of managing your pasture. So you can decrease larval contamination by collecting and removing manure, cross-grazing, and cropping. So manure collection. Larvae come from the manure. They come from the eggs that are in the manure. So if you collect that manure, you are in effect breaking the life cycle. Less manure, less eggs, less larvae, less reinfection. And it should really be done twice a week, especially in spring. So this time of year, definitely twice a week, because it's that 4 days where larvae can hatch and leave the manure and become effective. I've just got a little slide here from a paper that looked at larval loads on pasture and removing manure. Where's my pen gone? So here you've got this big spike where they didn't remove any of the manure, and here they have been removing the manure, and there's less larvae on the pasture. And it also got linked to lower fecal egg counts in all of their horses. Cross-grazing. Ruminants. So a ruminant is cow, sheep, goat, to an extent, alpacas. The alpacas are camelids, but they share the same sort of worms. Ruminants and horses do not share worms. Their digestive tracts are different, so therefore the worms that live in their digestive tracts are going to be different types of worms. So if you rotate your paddocks between horses and cows, then what happens is the cows will ingest those horse larvae, but they won't become infected. So they're effectively like vacuuming up all of those infective larvae off your pasture. Cropping, if you cut a hay crop, once you've cut the hay and collected it, that pasture is pretty much clean. You would say that that's a clean pasture, no infective larvae. So now you're probably saying, Jacqui, you haven't mentioned harrowing. Harrowing's an important part of pasture management. While harrowing might be good for the health of the grass and the health of the soil, what it does is it only spreads the larvae around more. Remember that larvae will survive on pasture for up to 6 months. So if you have your horse in a paddock for 3 months and then you go in, harrow it, rest it for 3 months and then put the horses back on, you're putting them back onto a probably heavily contaminated pasture still. If harrowing is part of your management practices, then what you would want to do is take your horse off the pasture, harrow, cross-graze with something else, so put cows in, and then put the horses back in. If you can't do that, the only time really to harrow is on hot, dry weather days where you'll harrow, break the manure up, and the sun will kill the worm larvae. Or if you're going to crop that paddock, or if you're going to rest it for at least 6 to 8 months. If we move on to now, so that was all pasture management, and now if we move on to management within the horse, so fecal egg counts and worming. Worming and fecal egg counts should always go hand in hand. Something I find fascinating about worming animals in Australia is that anyone can walk into a saddlery or a feed store and buy a wormer off the shelf. Can you do that for any other drug? Can you just walk into your saddlery and get a tub of penicillin because you think your horse has a bacterial infection? No, you can't. So you shouldn't actually worm your horse or treat your horse unless you've got an egg count to support why you want to worm them for. So that's my little rant about wormers. And actually, in Europe, some European countries, you cannot go and buy a wormer. You need to get a vet to prescribe it for you, which is something we don't want happening here in Australia. But, so remember, back to fecal egg counts, sorry. Strategic worming, that is where we only worm animals that have got an egg count of over 200 eggs per gram. So horses with over 200 eggs per gram, that's only going to be about 20% of horses. So you should only really need to worm about 20% of your horses to reduce overall egg shedding within your herd. Strategic worming is great because it reduces the overuse of drugs. And if you end up worming half of your horses, if you only need to worm half of them, other than the 20% that I mentioned, you can actually stop like 99 or 95% of egg shedding. But you need to know which half to worm, which is where fecal egg counts are important. So if you've had egg counts performed on your horses, usually they will be grouped as low, moderate, or high shedders. A low shedding horse will only need to be wormed once a year. Moderate shedding horses, usually twice a year, and high shedding horses should be wormed anywhere between 2 to 4 times a year. But these high shedding horses, once again, are probably only, this here, is your 20%. So not all of your horses need to be wormed multiple times a year. But all of your horses, whether or not they're low or high or moderate shedders, you should always check them twice a year. And you should check them in autumn and in spring. Yeah, autumn and spring. So once you've done your egg count, you get your report back. It says, it says worm your horse. So then your next question is, well, what do I worm them with? So wormers, they're called Anthelmintics, because that's the group of drugs they are. Helminth, there's the word helminth in there. So helminth means worm. So it's a drug that kills worms. Pretty much, when it comes to horse wormers, we've got 2 main classes. You've got macrocyclic lactones, which are sometimes called eumectins. And then, I'm so bad at this, I can never pronounce them, benzimidols, these ones, BZs. I call them BZs. That's easier for me to say, BZs. And within the macrocyclic lactones, you've got 3 actives that are registered for use in horses in Australia. That's ivermectin, abamectin, and moxidectin. And BZs, you've got oxybenzole and fenbendazole to be used. So these are your 2 major broad spectrum classes of wormers. You'll notice on wormers that there's always another one listed on there as well. For example, I've got boxes of wormers here. Let's find one. I'll just use my Equest again. It says it contains moxidectin and praziquantel. Where's my camera? Praziquantel. Now, praziquantel is only effective against tapeworm. Some of the other actives that are in there include your pyrantals and your marantal tartates. Now, these 3, so your praziquantel, pyrantal, and marantals, they're never given by themselves. They're either narrow spectrum, like praziquantel. So praziquantel, as I said, only works on tapeworms, or they're not very effective as a sole drug. So they're always given in combination with one of the mectins or one of the BZs. So base your wormer choice on whether you need to use a mectin, a macrocyclic lactone, or you need to use a BZ for that particular wormer. Brand names are not the drug. When people send me egg counts to do, I always ask them what was the last thing they wormed with. And a lot of the time I get given brand names. The problem with brand names is that it's usually marketing, and if you go by brand name, you might not actually know what you wormed with. So it's always important to read the little tiny writing underneath the name to see what you're actually using. And if you know that you want to use ivermectin, but you're not sure which wormers are an ivermectin, just go to your feed store or your saddlery and say, I want to purchase an ivermectin, and they will help you find one. But when I say brand names, is there's a lot of marketing around horse wormers, and that is because you can just go and buy one. So Equimax and Equimec, they're both ivermectin. One costs you $22 for a tube and the other one costs you $11. And really the only difference is that the Equimax is is in a shiny box. And then I'm going to get on my soapbox a bit here and let you know about ivermectin. It actually won a Nobel Prize. It was discovered in the 80s, but it only got its Nobel Prize in 2015. And we should be very, very grateful that we have it. So ivermectin it won its Nobel Prize because it's broad spectrum. It can treat so many parasite infections, so many different types of parasites. And the other amazing thing about it is it only requires one dose. I often have people say to me, oh, my horse had a high egg count. I've wormed it. Do I need to worm it again in 3 weeks? No, you do not. These drugs are designed that you worm your horse once and that once is enough. It's not like antibiotics where you have to take a course. And even though ivermectin, we use it in our horses, it won the Nobel Prize because it had such huge impact on human health itself, particularly in Africa, where lots of people had river blindness due to worms. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about horseworms. So, I'm like not running too much behind time. So that was me and my Strongyles spiel. Really quickly, if we go through some other common worms, we've got botflies. We all know about botflies. They're annoying. They lay eggs on the horse's coat. Always remove the eggs because, remember, prevention is better than a cure. And you should worm your horse with a boticide wormer. So a boticide is a mectin in autumn or early winter to catch any bot larvae that you didn't manage to clean off the horse's coat. Pinworms, they're relatively unpathogenic. That means they don't cause much disease. But people panic about them because they can see them. You often observe them because the females will leave, it's quite gross, they leave the anus and they lay their eggs around on the skin under the tail. So all of this lovely yellow stuff here is pinworm eggs. And you can just clean that off with warm water and iodine, or warm water and some kind of disinfectant. But usually whatever you worm to control Strongyles will get rid of the pinworms as well. So if you see pinworms on your horse, get an egg count done to see if you need to worm for Strongyles or not. And if you do, then you can treat the pinworms and the Strongyles together. Tapeworms. Everyone makes a fuss about tapeworms. I have only ever seen them on a fecal egg count once, and that was at the workshop I gave with Kathleen and the other C and K star students. So I still have only ever seen a tapeworm in a horse egg count once before. But if you use prosaquantol at least once a year, then that's enough to prevent any infections occurring in your horses. We have these ones here, Ascarids. The species name is Parascaris equorum. They're very, very pathogenic in young horses, so any young horse under 4 years old. You would normally only be concerned about them if you do run a stud farm and have lots of young horses, have lots of young horses coming and going. This here is a Parascaris egg, sorry. So you can actually ID them on a fecal egg count. So if you have young horses, you should stick on top of stay up to date with your fecal egg counts on them, because that way you'd be able to catch if you have an infection of them and prevent this here occurring, which is where a young horse got a huge burden and it ended up blocking the intestines because they're very big worms. If you do have these worms on your property, manage it with help from your vet. to prevent massive burdens occurring. And then summer sores. These are spread by biting flies. So the flies spread the worm larvae. Pretty much only really a problem or very common in the tropics or subtropics. If you can give protection from the flies, that's a good way to stop the spread, and it can be treated quite easily with Ivermectin or any of the other mectin wormers. And that's because what happens, that's the sore, and that's what happens when a fly bites and injects the parasite larvae into the skin. So how do you tell if your wormer worked? Do you ever ask yourself this? Do you ever worm your horse and then think, I wonder if it worked or not? Or do you just assume that it worked? Well, you should actually check. And you can check doing something called a fecal egg count reduction test, where you get a fecal egg count before worming, and then you worm, and then 10 to 14 days after worming, you get another fecal egg count done. And you compare the values. It's no good worming and then getting an egg count done, because you need a before and after to compare. Because really, if you only got an egg count, if you wormed, and then got an egg count done, all that's telling you is that, well, you don't know if there's no eggs because the wormer worked, or if there's no eggs because there were no eggs to start with. So you should always have a before and an after. And you really should get it performed once a year to make sure that your drugs are effective and your drugs are working. You should have a yearly schedule. So I'm going to talk through a yearly schedule with you all. Parasites are living creatures, and their life cycles are influenced by the seasons. So you can manage them on a yearly or a seasonal schedule. If we start off with autumn, autumn is key time for worms in Australia. You should get a fecal egg count done on all of your horses just to monitor them and see what's going on with their burdens. And you should worm all of them, because every horse really should get a clean out once a year. So while I've been saying, don't worm every 6 to 8 months, every 6 to 8 weeks, but you can worm. Worming every horse once a year isn't going to cause drug resistance. Because you're worming in autumn, we pick autumn because that allows us to target bots as well. So you do an egg count on all of your horses and you worm all of them with a boticide. That will remove Strongyles and it will remove bot flies. And then also at that point, that's a good time to get your fecal egg count reduction tests done, because you might not end up needing to worm your horses at any other point in the year. In winter, you only really need to get fecal egg counts done on horses that had an autumn count of above 500, or on any horses that are under 4 years old or in any other way immunocompromised. Spring is your other key time. Spring is when the weather warms up and the larvae start to hatch faster, and you get peaks in larval contamination on your pasture and peaks in egg shedding in your horses. So you should get fecal egg counts done on all your horses, and you only need to worm those that are over 200 eggs per gram or under 4 years old. And you should also keep on top of your paddock hygiene, particularly in spring. And then in summer, avoid worming your horses unless they are actually ill and showing symptoms. If you worm in summer, you'll end up killing dung beetles. Dung beetles are great for desiccating out manure pads, and you might also end up killing any of the other soil, like worms and things that help break down manure. Wormers can kill them as well. And in summer, if you remove adult populations of worms, that is where you end up creating that void, and you can end up with these large mass migrations of larvae, and that can result in colic. That's also called larval cyathostomes, and it's a horrible, horrible disease. So sometimes if your horses appear healthy and shiny and happy, just don't worm them, especially in summer. And just another point, harrow. Summer is when you can freely go out and harrow because you'll be breaking up the manure and killing off those larvae. What about wormer rotation? So when they used to tell you worm every 6 to 8 weeks and swap your wormers. Unpopular opinion, it's a marketing ploy. Because even if you did worm your horses more than 4 times a year, rotation of wormers doesn't stop drug resistance. Base your wormer choice on your fecal egg count results and what time of year it is, rather than what pharmaceutical companies tell you to do, because they just want you to buy their wormers. If you want to get a fecal egg count done, you can contact your vet or your local fecal egg count service. So you can contact me via Facebook through WormCheck. Fecal egg counts only require a 2-gram manure sample. So a sample of poo the size of a matchbox is more than enough. You should always collect nice, fresh samples. And if you collect them nice and fresh and bag them up airtight, then you can put them in the mail and post them to the labs. So about half of my samples that I do for people come via the post from all across Australia. I had some arrive from Queensland today. So if they're bagged up airtight, you don't send them in the middle of summer when it's really hot and you mail them by express. It's a quick and easy way of getting manure samples to a lab to get checked. Price ranges, I charge $10 per egg count, which is actually cheaper than worming. You know, a wormer will cost you $15 to $25. But other places, price ranges can be anywhere from, say, $10 up to $35 a sample, depending on where you go to get one done. So I haven't run out of time, nearly. To sum up, always get an egg count done before you worm. You should always diagnose before you treat. There's no such thing as routine worming anymore. Get your egg count done. Do you need to worm? Yes or no? That's not routine. A routine, the new routine, should be get an egg count done in autumn on your horses and get an egg count done in spring. And parasite management, you should now think of it as lowering pasture contamination rather than removing the worms from the horse. And in the end, horses really only need to be wormed 1 to 2 times a year. And that's it. I made it to the end. I took a lot longer than I thought I would.
That was great, Jackie. Super.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will open up the questions in the chat. So we've got a few in there already, but I have a question. What is the protocol for new herd additions? What do you do with those?
I would egg count, worm, egg count again. It's hard, isn't it? Because if you do an egg count and it says 0, then you don't know. There could still be worms there because sometimes horses have worms, but they just don't shed eggs. But really, you shouldn't be concerned about bringing worms onto a property. You should be concerned about bringing drug-resistant worms onto a property. So I would say if you have a place where you can quarantine a horse, proper quarantines are meant to last 6 weeks anyway or something, but none of us rarely do that. But yeah, do an egg count, see what the horse has, especially if they're young. You don't want them bringing on roundworm. That's Ascarids, because once you've got those on the property, they're very hard to get rid of. But new horse additions, I would say egg count, worm, egg count again, because the last thing you want is bringing on drug-resistant worms.
Thank you. We have a question. If you have a horse who is a low shedder and in autumn has a very low count, should you still worm? And also, are there considerations for aged horses?
So if your horse has got a low count in autumn, I would still say yes, worm. Each horse should have a yearly clean out because they can get a build up even if they don't show it. So that yearly clean out is good. It'll help you remove any bot flies because bots always get through no matter how much you sit there and cut the eggs off. So if you have a horse with that low count, you can worm them just in autumn, and that's probably the only worming that they'll need all year. Aged horses, some aged horses have got low egg counts. They've built up an immune system an immune response over their life, so they might not be, they might just have low burdens. They might not show any symptoms. If you've got an aged horse that is like immunocompromised, then you would want to keep up to date with tracking it with fecal egg counts and probably treating it as you would treat a young horse, so worming more often.
Fabulous. Stacey popped in a message. She said, wow, I never realised I'm definitely getting fecal egg counts now, which is good. And Rachel Edwards, so she's from North Metro Zone. She said she'd love to get in touch with you to come out to a rally once restrictions ease so you can bring your microscope. Which, yeah, as Jackie said earlier, she did a bit of a demo for some SMZ certificate C-Star K riders, and yeah, the kids couldn't get enough of it, could they, Jackie? They loved looking in the microscope, and when we found the rare tapeworm, it was harrowing.
I spent 10 minutes saying to everyone, there's no tapeworms aren't around, you don't need to worry about them. And then a girl brings in a sample. I'm like, oh my God, we found a tapeworm egg. I was so excited as well. So yeah, Rachel, yeah, I'm happy to come out. I do have a Facebook page. It's just called Worm Check. I'll put it in the chat. And Peggy as well, if you just message my Worm Check page, I can send you a submission form if you want to get egg counts done or have a chat to me about any of the stuff we've gone through today as well.
Do you have a website, Jackie?
I don't have a website yet because that costs money and time, and I haven't had the time to put into it.
Facebook's pretty handy, isn't it?
Facebook's been very handy. And when Facebook's free to use, you think, what do I need a website for?
Yeah. So Caroline asks, she says, we have a high shedder and he has been since birth. He's healthy, so should I still worm the 4 times a year, as he seems better being done in autumn and spring, as you said?
And you've put in later there, Caroline, that he has a reaction when he's wormed as well.
Oh, yep.
Yeah. If he's paddocked by himself, or you pack, or so if he's only like reinfecting himself, then you can probably reduce however many times you worm him. If he's paddocked with like susceptible animals, like younger horses or older horses, where he's infecting them, that's where you'd want to worm him more often. But I do find it tricky when horses have reactions to wormers, because I'm not a vet, so I can't tell you what to worm him with or how to control those reactions, because that's the horse, that's not the parasite that's causing that. And so, but yeah, that one is when it's like a more of an individual horse, and you would need to see what his egg counts are and exactly how he reacts. The vet suggested the worming more, or what's the vet suggested?
I think different types of wormers.
Yeah, because I have a friend and she says she can't worm her horse with, autumn and spring. Yeah, you can, if you worm him less, then you would pick your times. I would pick in autumn, usually when the weather's broken. So once the rain starts and the cold weather starts, that's your peak time in autumn. And then in spring, when the weather starts to warm up a bit, so about September. And And as long as his reactions aren't too bad, I suppose.
What about, Jacqui, I was thinking we should really think about when we feed horses on the ground. Should we be doing less of that? Should we? I know it's good for our horses to be fed down, or do you choose your spot?
I suppose you choose your spot. Mine are all fed in near the gateways that they destroy, so there's no grass there anyway, and they don't poo there. And horses actually have their poo sections, and they avoid eating there. So if you've got a really big paddock, and they'll poo in one section, you'll find the grass grows there, and the horses won't eat around it. So they've sort of got their own way of controlling, making sure they don't eat where it's more contaminated. But of course, if you're like me and you have small fat ponies that you have to keep locked up a lot, that's where picking up manure is a lot more important. Empty or full stomach?
And yeah, that's a good question, Anne.
I don't know, Anne. I haven't read anything that says anything about when to do it. They work, wormers, especially the mectins, they don't actually work as they go through. They're absorbed into the blood, and then they work like through they're fat solubles. So it's more being absorbed by the body than just passing through and killing the worms as they go. So it's something to, yeah, I can't answer that one. I'm just trying to think. Empty or full stomach? How far away? Oh, so my manure, Diana, is I pick it up and I'm just piling it in the paddock in a spot. The horses won't go near it, but it's piled up so it'll all compost. So you just want to stop the grass growing up through it, because the larvae are there on that grass that grows up through it if you leave it there. And the larvae will also actually sort of crawl away from the manure. I think about like 30 centimeters they can crawl away from the manure as well. So you just don't want the horses eating like on top of it or right around it.
Okay. Well, Jacqui, I think that might be all our questions. So on behalf of all of us and Pony Club Victoria, I wanted to just say thank you so much for coming in tonight. That was really, I've listened to you a few times and it's still very intriguing. And but it's important for those coaches who are in with us tonight and riders as well. The new syllabus is already updated with Pony Club Australia on the concepts that Jacqui has run through tonight, and Pony Club Australia are also currently updating the coaching manuals and the prelim, the first level that you do. The prelim is soon to be released, and its information is very much based on what Jacqui has spoken of tonight. So yeah, for those who have come in, this is the new way to do it. We've got a little bit of a question on cross-grazing.
Yeah, there was one more cross-grazing. So Tash, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there's any studies on it actually, because it's it's just this management system that people have been doing for years and years and years. You would want the cows to eat the grass, quite down. So you'd probably, it depends on the size of the paddock as well, doesn't it? So the grass might grow to a certain length. You put the cows in, they eat it down. You let it rest for a bit longer so it grows up again before the horses go back in.
Tash was in the Q&A. I can see her questions now. Sorry, Tash. Yeah. She also asked, why would Panacure, is it, be necessary to use? Any idea on why the protocol of using Panacure 100 is to give every day for 5 days?
Okay. So I don't like Panacure anymore. The 5 days for Panacure is to get rid of what's called encysted Strongyles. So sometimes this larvae of Strongyles go and encysted in the wall of the intestine. When they're encysted, they're fine. It's when they come out in this mass migration that you get problems. So if you suspect that your horse has got encysted Strongyles, often you will either get told to use a 5-day course of Panacure, or you get told to use Equest, which is moxidectin. I would say use Equest. It's been proven to be kinder on the horse's gut. But that 5 days is you're really hitting those infected Strongyles really hard over a course of 5 days to pull them out. So I would, if you're not going for encysted Strongyles and you wanted to use a BZ, I would rather go with, say, a oxfendazole rather than Panacure to treat. So anything like Strat T or Amogreen over Panacure. Because it's one dose, it's kinder on the horse, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Very good. I think that's it then.
Yes, I think so.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming in, and we're recording this, so we'll share it with everybody tomorrow, and it'll be on the Facebook page and the website as well at some stage. So thank you, Jacqui, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Jacqui.